And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Thursday, June 23rd. I'm your host for today's program, Paul Devane. Many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, and here are some of the news stories from the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. It was one of the more unusual crime scenes in American history. The slumping tarpaulin-covered Heat Endurance Lodge had disgorged dozens of victims into the red dirt near Sedona, Arizona. Some were burned, some were unconscious, others were in various states of organ failure. Two were already dead, and a third would later die at the hospital. What had happened was immediately clear to the first responders that arrived there. Those unfortunates, all of whom had paid nearly $10,000 apiece to participate in a week-long spiritual warrior retreat, had stayed in an overheated, overcrowded sweat lodge for far too long. But it would take more than 18 months to decide who was ultimately responsible for the deaths. And on Wednesday of this week, an Arizona court convicted James Arthur Ray, 53, the New Age guru who led the retreat, on 3 counts of negligent homicide. Jurors needed less than 12 hours to decide that Ray was the architect of the evening and ultimately the one who is accountable for their suffering. He faces up to 11 years in prison and may be sentenced later this month already. The Supreme Court refused this week to get involved in a long-running dispute on the continued existence inside of the Yankton Sioux Reservation in southeastern South Dakota. The justices let stand several rulings in 4 related cases that are part of a legal battle stretching back nearly 2 decades. One case involves rulings by a federal judge in an appeals court that found a small part of the once huge Yankton Sioux Tribes Reservation still exists and remains under the legal jurisdiction of the tribe and federal government. The state in Charles Mix County had argued through the legal battles that the reservation was disestablished or eliminated in the late 1800s, but U.S. District Judge Lawrence Pearsall agreed with the tribe and the U.S. government when he ruled in 2007 that the reservation covers nearly 37,000 acres of land, or 59 square miles, which mostly consist of land the government holds in trust for the tribe and individual members. Yankton Sioux Chairman Robert Coynoyer praised the Supreme Court's decision not to hear the appeal on whether the reservation still exists. And now we go to Alaskan Public Radio Network News Director Lori Townsend for a report on some of the things that are going on in Alaska. Lori Townsend, give us a little bit of update about what's happening in Indian country out of that Anchorage, Alaska office that you hold up there, and tell us what what the Alaska Public Radio Network is carrying lately.
I will do that. Hi, Paul. Well, it's a beautiful day here in South Central Alaska, and we were trying to catch some salmon this morning, but didn't have any luck. So we'll try later on, see if we can't catch some more.
All right.
Any at all. But salmon is a big issue, of course, in the state, always is. But we've had a lot of trouble this spring with bad runs coming into the Yukon River and some of the other rivers. The state has closed down subsistence fisheries. And sometimes those closures are only for a few days, but even that really impacts people who are trying to make it out there. It's their traditional, customary way of life. And for people in the villages that are already hard hit by staggeringly high fuel prices and just the cost of living generally, and then, there's not a lot of employment in the villages. A lot of it's seasonal work. And so people are really getting hit because they depend very heavily on salmon, not only to feed themselves and their community members, but also it's a good system of trading and bartering also, that they use fish to get other things that they need. And so because of the treaty that the U.S. has with Canada, a certain escapement has to get through up into Canada. And so that's what's happening. There's not enough fish coming through, and they're closing the runs.
Okay, and does that impact sports fisheries and subsistence fisheries the same? For example, does sports fishery get cut by 50%? Subsistence fisheries get closed off by 50%? Is it impacted directly, or is there any kind of a gauge? Does they close off the sports fishery first and then the subsistence in order to get those allocations out to Canada?
Well, that is how the federal mandates work, so that if there are tons of shortage, it's the subsistence rules in rural Alaska apply, that people have the right to first shot at getting those resources if there's a shortage.
Right.
So any kind of sport fishing would be shut down first. But it also depends on the river and the run and what's open on that river. But it's a growing concern. There was just a report that came out the other day about a very grave report about the state of the world's oceans. It was the International Program on the State of the Oceans. A group of scientists came out with this very comprehensive report that is alarming. One of the lead scientists said it's shocking what's happening to the oceans between overfishing. There's a lot of illegal, unregulated fishing out there, and pollution, ocean acidification, warming of the oceans, and
Everything.
all these things combined, right, are really impacting the runs, and they're warning of a possible mass extinction in some of these places. We're seeing a lot of these growing dead zones that used to be just kind of a seasonal thing, and some of them are more year-round now. There's a lot of talk about the dead zones based on the flooding that's been happening in the southern part of the United States. So there's a lot of stress on the oceans, and we're seeing those impacts on these reduced runs and people not being able to get the fish they need.
Dead zones basically are zones that lack oxygen to sustain marine biology in life?
Absolutely, yes. And so it's just a huge kind of like this area that's absolutely devoid of anything that can sustain life. And that's just troubling to think about and to consider, that there are increasingly large areas like that in the world's oceans, and how much that impacts the world's food supply and will continue to be more and more of a large impact. So we're hoping for better runs of salmon here as the spring progresses into summer.
You've been watching the developments in Oregon, Washington, where some of the dams are coming down, and actually some of those runs apparently are beginning to rebuild themselves, but it's taken 10 years or longer, restocking, rebuilding the water system to make sure that there isn't runoff in certain places, to make sure there is water in certain places. They're taking major dams out. You think that those are the kinds of things that Alaska is going to have to start doing now? It's almost like you're just seeing the decline now. They're actually rebuilding stocks in the lower 48.
Well, we don't have that type of infrastructure on most of the waterways here in Alaska that they have in the lower 48. There's been talk of building a huge hydro dam on the Susitna River out in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. And so there's been talk of that for a long time, but we don't have a lot of those dams in places that people had there down south. But certainly the runs up here are impacted by what's happening down there, because those fish are coming this way, and then they're supposed to make their way into Canada, and if not the proper amount of escapement gets through, then they have to shut down the runs until enough get through to meet those treaty obligations with Canada.
Right.
Yeah.
What else is going on up in Alaska besides the subsistence issue, which is always ongoing, and something that probably is going to have a lot more litigation and discussion and probably needs a lot more cooperation amongst all the groups. But what else is going on in Alaska?
Well, right now there's a lot going on with the 40th anniversary of ANCSA. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is 40 years old. And so tribes are really starting to look at what they would like to change about the Claims Settlement Act. And I've talked to tribal leaders and said, do you really think you'll be able to open that back up and change things? And they point out that ANCSA has been amended numerous times. About 11 times there's been amendments, but primarily those amendments, according to the people that I've talked to, have benefited the Alaska Native corporations and not so much directly to tribes. So tribes are putting together this document they're calling the Tribal Accord, and what they're working toward doing is three main tenets primarily. One is transferring the land holdings that are now held fee simple title by the corporations. They want to transfer that land back to the tribes so that the tribes have control of the land and the corporations do economic development initiative.
It's not in trust like a lot of land in the U.S. is. It's not held by the U.S. government. It's held. The title is held by corporate entities, which are different than tribal governments, right?
Yes, very much so. Although the corporate entities often push for recognition as tribal governments, and so there's been meetings where, and part of the problem is that a lot of federal officials don't understand the distinction and the very, very big differences between a tribal government and a corporation leader. So the tribes are pushing back against that because there's been some very high-level meetings in Washington where corporation heads were invited in and tribal leaders were not. So Fort Yukon, the Gwich'in people in Fort Yukon have transferred their land back to the tribal council holder, the folks that are running the tribe, so that they can make sure that it's protected into the future, and then they just work with the corporation to do economic development. But the concern, of course, is that if the native corporation gets in trouble and debtors come after them, creditors come after them and seize assets, they can seize that land. Or
come after the hard assets and the land and buildings and so forth.
Yeah, so that's the big fear now. That and the fact that because of the way the Claims Settlement Act was set up with the corporations and people becoming shareholders after 1971,
right.
People are called afterborns. They're not shareholders now. They can get shares inherited, but they can't. They don't get them at birth like people before 1971 did. So, of course, what's happening is the shares are getting increasingly fractionated, and people have concerns about the fact that some say up to 75% of young Alaska Natives now aren't corporation members because they were born too late. And so they want that changed.
Is it going to be so much a celebration for anybody on either side of this? Alaska might want to celebrate it. The indigenous people, they're going to analyze it, not necessarily celebrate. They'll be there in some way, form, or fashion. But
yes, there has been a lot of good informational panels. Nellie Moore has been leading these discussions with tribal leaders and Alaska historians about the Claims Settlement Act and what was happening at that time, the political climate, and how people were trying to get things done. But one of the leaders that I listened to, Mayor Edward Itta, talked about from the North Slope Borough, talked about how when they were in the claims settlement time, it wasn't that they weren't sophisticated, but it was a different mind and worldview to think about millions of dollars. And it was so hard for them to comprehend how much is enough and what does $1 million mean in a cash economy.
Right. Where can people find these stories and other ones that Alaska Public Radio is putting online?
You can go to, now it's alaskapublic.org. We've changed our website. You can still get there by going to aprn.org, but we're co-located now, and it's alaskapublic.org.
Alaska Public. We'll go there and check it all out. Thanks for joining with us, Lori. We'll do it again in the near future, okay? Miigwech.
Thanks, Paul. Bye.
And because we have 2 crews out, we'll probably join back with you for the next issue of the Native News Update on Monday, June 27th, with all the news that's read enough to be read.